Okay, amazing. The recording should be up now. Lovely. So, here is the workshop. I'm gonna share this. Don't worry, but I'm gonna share in the Zoom right now. Anyone can link can view. Yeah, I'll share this in the Zoom chat so you guys can just like look at it quickly. Okay, I'm gonna share. I present full screen. Let's go. All right. Don't mind the. So I'm sharing the full screen, so you probably will see like the side there, the thing, but it should be fine. So, anyways, welcome everyone to um the first part of the Judging Fundamental series. This is a workshop series that I have been planning for a while. To give essentially everyone who was ever interested in judging, whether it be in any format, just the basics of how to judge. So this is going to be a series. So this is the first part of the workshop. Most of this first part is going to cover mostly the fundamentals of what you should do and what should not do. Mostly emphasis on things you shouldn't do in judging, because I think there are a lot of things that I've seen so many judges that they do that they really shouldn't do. So we'll cover this workshop into basically what is judging, and then essentially how to evaluate claims and responses, the average reasonable voter. Also, we'll do a cover note on just like how to track, etc. Right? So a bit about me, though I don't think it's that necessary. My name is, as you know, Imran Ilmam. I'm a two-time Asian major breaking judge. I've broken at UADC in 2023, and also a bunch of high tier opens like Zagreb Pre-Worlds, Diliman Debate Open, Diliman Pre-ABP, Sunway Debate Open, etc. Um, Suffice to say, I've been judging for quite a while. This is something that I am quite literally a specialist in. I do this much more than I do debating, but and I hope that I can encourage you all to do judging, because I generally think it is a very good sub hobby aside from debating, because it not only helps your debating, but it also gives you a lot of crucial skills that can trickle down towards life. That out of the way, let's get started. So I think the first question that it's very important to address is what judging actually is, regardless of like what the format is, because the judging philosophy applies all across AP, BP, WSDC, regardless. So the concept of judging is simple. As we know, when you debate, you are wanting to present a case to persuade the judge, who is now like you, assuming, on why you should be able to win. Essentially speaking, they are going to argue to you, and you have the job to listen to them, but also you have to listen to them in respect of the rules of British parliamentary. Very specific on the rules of British parliamentary, because I think this is where a lot of first time judges miss out. The problem that I notice in a lot of judges is that they go into judging with their own philosophies in mind, with their own way on thinking how they should judge, without actually realizing that BP judging follows a very specific set of criterias and guidelines that judges should follow in order to be able to fairly assess the debate. With this in mind, obviously the core of judging is being able to assess the persuasiveness of speeches according to a set of shared judging criteria rather than your own views. I'll talk about more on interventionism a bit later, but the core crux of judging is just you need to be able to be objectively sit there, listen to 1 hour of speeches, know how to judge this, and be able to judge fairly. All right. So, okay, apparently this is blocking. So the first concept I want to talk about is the concept of the average reasonable voter. I think this is something, if you've been to tournaments before, you should know essentially what it is based on like the judge briefings that you should see. This is fairly common. This is a fairly common thing that happened, like is really talked about in judge briefings. But I don't think people really focus on this concept a lot, especially judges, and this is very important. So there's 4 things to note about the average reasonable voter. And this is the average reasonable voter is basically the persona that you are taking for every debate you're judging. Every debate you're judging, you must let go of all the biases you have all the knowledge, the spec knowledge you have. So for example, if there's a football motion, but everyone doesn't really know football and you are the one who know football, you should let go of your knowledge of football and be able to judge the debate that is happening as if you were just a normal person. So what are the characteristics of this person and why they're important? You're basically a person who has a great deal of knowledge that is like broad but not deep. So you probably know that there's COVID-19 happened and everyone had lockdowns, but you don't know how each country had their specific lockdown rule. This is important because maybe you come from a country and you know how the lockdown happened in that country, but if let's say, for example, a debate about like the COVID-19 pandemic happened within that context of the country, but the debaters don't come from that country. So for example, if I'm a Malaysian judge and I'm judging something within about a Filipino spec thing, I don't know anything, so I probably shouldn't use biases, but also the flip side happens. So a Filipino is judging a debate that's within the Filipino context, even if all debaters know what went on, you should be able to not take spec knowledge as it is. Spec knowledge is basically anything that requires like actual context and reading, but a lot of things should be proven. So for example, if I pull out a statistic like this X thing has Y thing, but I don't prove the claim as a speaker, you should not be able to accept that as it is because debaters have the burden to prove why that statistic is true. And this is one of the reasons why statistics are discouraged in debating, because from the perspective of the judge, you have no way to fact check that statistic because like debaters, you can't Google during debates. So you actually have to ensure teams prove a very specific thing if it is not intuitive. Another thing, yeah, so that's concept 1 and 2. Concept 3 is the concept of being able to follow and analyze a debate. So this is basically how to track. So I'll cover like essentially how I track in a bit, like when I cover like how to track, when I cover like the way you set up judging and tracking. But essentially speaking, you have the job to track a debate as it happens all the way. And I think a problem that a lot of judges fall into is that they fail to track a debate fully, and therefore they don't know what happens, or their notes are way too messy, and then they don't really know what goes on in the debate. You need to be able to create a system for yourself, create a setup for yourself, whether it be paper, whether it be hybrid, whether it be docs, but you need to be able to create a system for yourself where you can not only track the debate, but judge the debate as it happens. And that is basically how you should be able to judge. The last thing to note is that persuasion is subjective, and I think judges are persuaded by different things, and there's different judge philosophies. And this really happens in high-level rooms. But what's important to note is that we should not judge based on metrics, like very arbitrary metrics, i.e. style, i.e. humor, i.e. rhetoric alone. Rather, these things are tools of persuasion. For if someone used their humor to prove a point and they actually proved the point well, then it is to be put in consideration on whether that persuaded you. However, that should not be the main metric you should judge the debate on. Like, I should not be judging someone based on how fancy the words they're saying, on how funny they said, but rather on the various structural reasons they gave to prove a claim. And I'll go on into just generally speaking how people prove things like a bit later and how you should evaluate that. Lovely. So let's talk about persuasiveness and generally speaking how to evaluate claims. And I think this is going to be the real meat of the workshop, because most of the questions I've gotten is just, Imran, how do you judge things? How do you evaluate responses? How do you evaluate claims? How do you compare things, etc.? So obviously, we judge debates without prejudice. I think this setup has been quite clear. So the next time you walk into debates, you want to let go of all the knowledge you have. You want to just come into there and hey, I'm judging this. I'm going to judge this debate without being any form of bias. So in terms of persuasiveness, let's look into the perspective of a debater. Every claim you make, every argument have reasons to be given to why that thing is true. So for example, if I'm going to say smoking is bad, that may be intuitive to the average person, but the average reasonable voter, despite finding that claim intuitive, should not be able to just accept it as it is, especially if another team just says, oh, smoking is bad. If a team says smoking is good and another team says smoking is bad, and they don't explain why that's the case, then you probably shouldn't really buy both claims as it is together without addressing the structural reasons that are given below the claims to be proven. Unless both teams don't equally prove their claims, then I'll get on into necessary interventions later. But the point of this is that the way you judge is you need to be able to read how teams want to prove a specific argument based on the burdens they're giving. So for example, if the previous example is if the house would ban smoking, this house would ban smoking, and the team says this house smoking is bad, they're obviously wanting to achieve the burden that the smoking is bad, that smoking is bad. That's why we should justify banning smoking. So following the burdens is essentially speaking, you are looking at the headline of what follows that burden. So a team sets up a burden for themselves, or you kind of figure out what the burden is. They want to prove that smoking is bad. And then you want to look at the middle analysis, which is the reasons why smoking is bad, reasons why this is true, or why it is important, or why this is a specific thing. And obviously, there's also stylistic ways, because every debater has different ways upon which they deliver a specific argument. These are not the primary way, but they help in clarity and if it's very structured, etc. But the real meat is the actual analysis or matter, the reasons given, the middle analysis. So the way you want to work this out, especially when you're tracking, is it goes as follows. So I'm just going to segue very quickly into tracking. But before that, the second thing, this is just a small thing. Just note that style and analysis. So for example, the rhetoricness of a speaker does not mean that they win immediately. Just because someone has very sexy words and delivers it in a very boso manner speech, if the reasons they're giving aren't proving their burden, it doesn't really mean anything. Also, on the other extreme end, maybe a team has very good reasons to prove something, but they give it in a way where you literally cannot understand the argument, then that's on them, because debaters also have the burden to make sure that their arguments are understandable to a judge. So before I go on with the workshop, I do want to briefly just cover. Okay, before I go to the rest of the workshop, I want to briefly cover how I track, and essentially speaking, how you guys can follow this. You don't have to follow my format, but I think this is very important in case. So I'm just going to pick one of my random tracking documents. This was the open finals of Dilemma Debate Open on YouTube, by the way. You should watch it. It was really great. So the way I judge is, I think, relatively unique, but also a bit weird, because I don't think anyone else has used this format. Everyone else has a different format, but I think I want to get onto the meat of how you track. Firstly, obviously, speakers are going to headline what they're saying. There's going to signpost. They're going to say, this is my framing. This is my argument. This is my, within the argument, you have the reasons given to prove that argument, and etc. So let's say, for example, I'm going to look at the LO speech. So this is the characterization, and they characterize two things. What is postmodernism? It is two things, this, and this. What's very important when you're tracking, and I think this is something that when you are and by the way, track everything. Literally track everything that you are writing down. Track everything that they're speaking. Actually, there's a fine line. Don't necessarily track everything to a point where you get overwhelmed, but track what matters. You need to be able to understand. When you're listening, you probably don't have to literally transcribe everything. If you're writing on paper, you probably realistically cannot. And even on docs, you probably can't. But what I mean by track everything is track what is important. What does the speaker want you to take in? So for example, if you're listening to the speech, right, you probably want to take down the headline, because that's a pretty important aspect of what they're trying to give to you, what context they want to give. You probably want to track essentially, let's say, not necessarily a summary, but if it takes like a lot. They're probably going to like wrap towards something. You want to understand what they're trying to say and try to like boil it down. So this is an open finals where speakers have made a lot of context. You can see how you can probably tell that I haven't written down literally everything, but I've wrote down what's important. So applies in humanities, blah, blah, blah. It challenges theoretical interpretations. Here's the argument. Okay, now we go on to tracking, and in terms of like how you should track arguments and the way that you make your life easy. So this is the argument headline. And obviously, most arguments have things like the premise and the reasons given behind that premise. So these are 4 subjects, and this is the impacts, and there's 4 impacts here, and they layered their impacts. You need to be able to layer the way you judge as well, because at a point in which you're able to make your tracking notes readable, it is very easy for you to look back at the debate and like when you're paneling, you can contribute to the panel discussion via notes, etc. And like basically this is how you track. And of course, like write down POIs, etc. But I think you can tell how I generally track, and I think speakers should try to do this, like the judges try to do this. The first is noting what they're doing within their speech. If they're going in one argument, you should probably be tracking that specific argument and noting that specific argument and writing that thing. If you're gonna write responses, as you can see here, I wrote specifically 3 responses here, and this is the actual response, etc. Just write it down, and then etc. And then be able to compartmentalize essentially, so that you know exactly what you're reading and seeing, etc. Right? So this is just a note on tracking. Another thing on tracking that I think is important. I'm going to pull up one more sheet before we get on to the debate. Sorry, we get onto the workshop. It was something about, yeah, okay. So this is another tracking document I have. This one's a bit different than the other one because the other one was an open final, so I judged differently. This one is a SPAR. So the crucial difference that I have in this one is, if you can tell, everything in bold is either things that are important or anecdotes. Okay. Oh, okay, someone's muted. Please do mute. Why is this important? Because obviously, when you are tracking the round, you cannot wait until the end of the debate before you start judging. That is a terrible idea. Please do not do that. I have met so many trainees who have had to tell me, I'm sorry, I need like 5 minutes to organize my notes. Unfortunately, as much as us judges benefit from time and being able to look through our notes excessively and give like the best OA, etc., tournaments are going to be limited. There is a hard 15 limit on DLIPs and a hard limit of 15 on OAs. And after the debate, if you are then judging, you probably are going to overwhelm yourself because you do not know what the comparisons are. So the way you should do anecdotes and judging on the go is essentially just when you are listening to an argument, you probably also have additional thoughts of like, so is this argument actually being proven? Or is OO actually responding to this argument? Or, I don't actually buy this framing because it feels like maybe the reasons given to that was enough. You want to write down those thoughts immediately in a way. This is why this per anecdotes. And you know how like the way I kind of write justification immediately, and I think like other speakers can kind of like benefit from that, is that of course at the end of each speaker, there's like that weird timing where they have to introduce the next speaker. So you have 30 seconds of free time where you should probably spend that time writing down what you thought about that speech in the context of judging the actual round. So don't write your actual comments in terms of feedback, but you need to write, what did the speech actually accomplish for me? So all of this, I didn't write everything. Everything in down is like the actual OA, but this part here is just what I basically wrote as a summary for what the speaker is doing. This as well is what I'm writing. So like, these things, blah, 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 blah. And everything else, etc. is just like, you know, what I'm commenting. You know, this extension is derivative, this blah 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 blah, etc. Right? So what I've just given here is a note on how you should track. I'm going to give a BP judging template later, so that if you do want to note this, but if you're going to use your own format, like your own way of judging, I would suggest just following these key concepts. The first is track down what is important, what the speakers are saying, what is the point of the thing they're saying. Secondly, be able to understand what they're saying and make sure that you've put it down in a way that is structured so that you can always refer back to it and understand what you're looking at. And the thirdly is always judge while you are debating. This looks like writing down anecdotes or little notes on the justification, the mini justification you're giving per speaker. Try to do this in opportunities you can where you don't have to track so heavily. Okay, so that's basically a heavy chapter on tracking. I will answer more tracking questions because I know there's a lot of questions about how you should track a bit later. Okay. So going back to the workshop. How do you evaluate claims? How do you evaluate judge? And this is how do you evaluate like things? So obviously, you need to be able to write down the things that are being said and accurately assess it. Don't write everything. You need to understand the key phrases and conclusions that teams are trying to reach. So for example, maybe a team gives a 1-minute explanation on why smoking is bad. You as a judge can probably summarize that in a few key things into smoking is bad because it gives you lung cancer. It is bad for your health. Okay, that's the two same things. It harms other people. XYZ reasons. Teams may take 1 minute, but you can obviously summarize that, and I think you should try to summarize that. I'll answer that question later up because I'll focus on the workshop, but I promise I'll get back to you. The second thing to note about judging, and this is another important thing to note when it comes to evaluating claims, do not step in. And I think I covered this before on not being able to intervene. Do not step in to complete a missing link. So for example, you need to be, let's say a team says, smoking is bad and it kills people, that's why we should kill the horse. Okay, obviously, very insane conclusion, but my point is, sometimes teams will give XYZ reasons, and then the impact they're giving is ridiculous or does not link to the actual reasons they're giving. Don't step in and think, they said smoking bad, that's why we should kill horses, and like link the two together by filling in if they don't prove the link or if they don't prove the impact. You need to be objective and observant on whether they actually prove the claim, whether they actually met the criteria of an argument. Another thing to note about not stepping in, and this is crucial, do not set your own burden on the team. And this is something that I see a lot of judges, a lot of trainee judges do, where the reason they give me is, I'm sorry, I don't think their arguments really followed the motion, therefore I cannot credit it. Firstly, what parts of the argument can't you credit? But secondly, and most importantly, that's unfair. Because imagine you're a debater, you're giving an argument based on what the motion is, what you think the emotion is. Maybe it's different. It's going to be different. 5 different debaters have 5 different reads about how emotion goes. As a judge, you are open to all the ways teams interpret emotion and argue based on those interpretation on the emotion, but you're not necessarily fully open per step 2. You shouldn't link things or buy things to be winning just because it is like a way of seeing it, but you should be able to take it as it is. Arguments are persuasive not because you like them. They are persuasive because they are substantiated, they are given impacts, and they follow the criteria that they set for themselves. And arguments can become less persuasive and impactful if they are rebutted but you should also be able to evaluate the response, the strength of that response, and what does it actually crucially take down. And going into rebuttal, keep track of rebuttal, and you always want to make sure that the rebuttal you are tracking, like link it back to the argument that they want to rebut, and evaluate whether that rebuttal actually took it down. But remember, and this is a final concept that I need everyone to be important. Judging is all about spectrums. What do spectrums mean? To some extent, there's a balance of likelihoods, whether something is either probably maybe in the 50-50 zone or very likely to happen. Like intuitively, it's going to happen. Like if you flip a coin, it's probably going to get heads. But sometimes it may be not less likely to happen. There's always going to be a spectrum of whether a claim is going to be true or to what extent it is important or to what extent it is going to be true. And this applies to responses very importantly because rebuttals, to some extent, cannot fully take down a well-substantiated argument, no matter how well-structured the response is to some extent. Because there's always going to be circumstances where a claim could be true, but there's also going to be circumstances where the response is true. So you have to balance which is going to be more likely, and that evaluation is the assessment of whether a rebuttal did take down an argument, or even if it didn't take down an argument, maybe it mitigated it enough to a point where, I can kind of credit this response because it did question X to a good extent. And I'll like essentially it is your job to cover the strengths of the positive arguments that teams are giving and also the responses that they're giving. All right. So let's look at team comparisons. And this is essentially the very important step of BP judging specifically, but this also applies in AP judging. So very crucially, do not credit an opening team for a rebuttal that their closing did. So if CG rebuts OO, but OG doesn't rebut OO, OG can't win because of CG. Another team's responses do not contribute to a certain bench winning alongside them. For example, like another thing is that sometimes teams get quote unquote boxed out. That is to say that, like this usually happens in OG, where because of the recency bias, they will give an argument and either no one really responds to it or everyone tries to make them irrelevant. Do not buy them to be irrelevant immediately just because every other debater says they're irrelevant. What you should do is still evaluate the argument as it is, even if you think deep down that they're probably boxed out, but sometimes even boxed out teams still need to be compared with other houses in the debate. So you still need to compare their material to other arguments. Note, unresponded arguments don't mean that it wins. You still need to be able to consider the strength of that argument in comparison to other teams. So if I have an unresponded material X and I prove it, I have to compare that to CO probably, even if CO doesn't respond to it, and see how it affects the CO case. Okay. So obviously, you not only have to assess the importance of like comparative importance of each piece of material, but you also have to compare to what extent teams prove their arguments, especially within like diametrically opposed arguments and diametrically opposed houses. Diagonal houses, my bad. So like the short diagonal comparison OOCG, the long diagonal comparison OGCO. You obviously have to compare which is most proven, which responses take down the most, which of these responses are proven. And this also applies heavily in bench comparisons, where both gov benches want to prove something. They're probably going to prove the same thing. It's your job to assess whether a team proved something better. Okay, let's talk about burdens. As I've highlighted before, do not set your own burden on the team because that's unfair. However, burdens cannot just be asserted to exist, especially if they don't prove why this burden is important, unless it's intuitive. So maybe you hear a motion and they say, we want to prove that this is a bad thing. That's probably intuitive. Like if the policy says this is a bad thing, then the debater says, we want to prove that this is a bad thing. That's probably a very valid burden. They don't have to assert it. It's intuitive. However, sometimes teams may not fully meet their burden. maybe teams don't fully prove their case, or as I said, there's a spectrum of how you fulfill a burden. It does not mean it is a black and white thing. So just because you fail to save the world, maybe you save some aspects of the world, therefore that can be credited in of itself. So even if analysis does not meet the burdens in the debate, it is not an auto loss. And this is crucial. There's no such thing as an auto loss. You have to compare how teams met their burden. How do you figure out a burden? It's very kind of important. Usually it's implied by the motion in of itself, as obviously, but also it can be set up by specific teams depending on the way they are framing it. So the example here is that this house believes that assassination is a legitimate tool of foreign policy. LO says that assassination is a severe breach of international law. That argument is not linked towards the motion, and for them to link it, they probably have to frame why illegality means illegitimacy. Illegality probably means illegitimacy because, again, it is a wrong that it is a moral wrong that the average reasonable voter cares about. It is something that and people follow laws, they care about these laws, state obligation, etc. Those aren't arguments in of itself, but that's framing. That's why teams frame, actually. Because teams frame because they want to set a specific important, they want to either tell the judge what is not relevant in the debate and frame what specifically the burden they're trying to set up for themselves. Okay. Metrics. Metrics are different from burdens because burdens are the extent towards which you give a claim, to prove a claim. They are the reasons given, and it's basically how you're assessing the strength, how the strength of the reasons you're assessing. Metrics are like clashes, they're like issues. So for example, vulnerability, magnitude, gravity. I'm sure you've heard these words before, but in case you don't know, metrics are basically criteria within the round that you should be able to adjudicate on. So for example, most debates often have stakeholders in which the debaters are trying to protect. They want to argue why they should protect them, why a harm has been occurred, and how we're going to fix this problem. And the other house also agrees that this stakeholder is important. So minorities, maybe structural barriers, etc., developing countries, etc. Maybe like any form of stakeholder, given that it is proven to be something it is very important to protect, that is the metric of how well a team protects that stakeholder, which creates an issue or a question of which house protects this vulnerable stakeholder more. So the metric is basically the way in which the criteria to assess whether the motion should be passed or not. Usually, if your life is easy, and in a lot of debates, there's usually one issue, one big clash about whether saving the most lives is important or what is the best way. Sometimes they may not implicitly say it, they may not frame it, or they may not weigh it, but it's kind of intuitive to figure out that you probably want to save lives based on the arguments that are being given in the round. Sometimes, and this happens in a lot of low-level groups, teams do not agree on any issue, and teams are asserting metrics. Teams have the burden to prove why the metric they're giving is comparatively more important than other teams' metrics. So let's say we want to protect this stakeholder, but Op wants to protect, no, Op says, no, the economy is more important. Then there's probably going to be a deadlock of which is a more important metric. If a team is able to prove why protecting poor people matters more than the economy, then they should get the credit for proving why that's the case. You should not step in and assume that, I think we should protect poor people because I don't care about the economy. I don't care if you don't care about the economy. What you should care about is, did they prove why we should care about the economy? And that's something you should always ask yourself when you judge. Did they prove something? Did they prove this to be important? What is the burden towards to prove this argument? Was the material given in the round relevant to prove that claim? That is essentially how metrics kind of work, and like all in a whole, how you should question yourself in terms of assessing the criteria within the debate and whether teams fulfill that criteria or not. Okay. Another common mistake that I see a lot of teams make, and unfortunately I've fallen victim into this as debaters as well, is that a pragmatic argument does not equal an auto win, especially if it's a principle debate. So for example, you should probably not assume a full utilitarian framework unless teams, again, explain that utilitarianism is the most important framework and they're able to compare that with other frameworks. So you can't disregard the principle just because it has no pragmatic outcome. Maybe it will weaken it. It depends on the debate. But sometimes the principle is strong enough to convince you that that matters more than the pragmatic. So even if a practical outcome happens, a principle reasoning, a moral reasoning that persuades you that something ought to happen may matter more than a pragmatic, depending on how teams argue this. So they should be able to explain what the aims of the principle are and evaluate the moral harm or the principal harm within that context, or like why such things are vital. And there are also principal burdens as well, and you have to compare these burdens against other teams, whether the principal burden the team is fulfilling is much more comparatively more important than a easier pragmatic burden. Because yes, it's easy to see that golf proves people are dying, that's probably bad. Yes, it's probably bad, but sometimes there's a policy which is probably morally harmful because of like the way that states should operate, and this leads to a slippery slope. So maybe people are dying, but what if this is also important? That's a lot of what judging is. It is, what if this is also important? What if this is also important? You should always consider everything to be valid, unless it is absolutely ridiculous. And even if it is absolutely ridiculous, teams can still give reasons to why it is true. I'm not going to name the debate, but there was this one round where the motion was something about this house prefers a world where this house prefers a world where people establish short-term relationships, went into multiple short-term relationships as opposed to one long-term relationship. So there was a team in opposition. I'm not going to name who. They basically ran, guys, if we have many short-term relationships, and this house prefers a world motion, and there's a world reset, that means people in the medieval ages are going to jump around and go into short-term relationships. Diseases were very common back then, especially STDs. If we allow short-term relationships to fester, that means that many more people die from STDs. That sounds ridiculous, and it is. But even if you think it is ridiculous, it does not mean that you should discredit the argument fully, even if you think it is out of pocket. Because sometimes teams will prove an argument you think that is ridiculous, and sometimes it kind of can make sense. Maybe it has a very high burden to prove that it's true, etc., and teams can respond to that, and you obviously have to assess the strength of, is this actually is this intuitive or not? Like, you can probably give yourself the judgment that I probably don't, this is a very high barrier of likelihood to happen on your own accord, but you kind of still have to compare that material with other teams' material and not disregard it fully. So this is extending not just principles, but even things that you don't really find intuitive. Because sometimes you may not understand the point of an argument, especially if you're in a round like where you don't really have a lot of knowledge in. So I think a lot of debaters struggle in finance motions. You probably don't understand what the hell is going on in a finance motion, but you should still track and evaluate like whether they say they want to fulfill this burden. Like, let's see the reasons given. Okay, but I don't get what's going on. I don't know what finance is, but they're telling me that. Okay, I think that was my Google or something. But essentially speaking, evaluate a claim as it happens. Okay, let's talk about decision and deciding how you make sure a specific house is over a house. So I'm going to go back to the way I judge and just break down how I would decide and tell you guys the thought process of how I decide comparisons. And this, generally speaking, goes into the meat of how you evaluate claims, etc. So I'm gonna go into a relatively easy round. Okay. So this was so let's just say the motion is this house prefers under the veil from the veil of behind the ignorance, this house prefers to be born as a sociopath as opposed to an average person. Let's just look at the opening comparison. Let's say OG says empathy sucks for 4 reasons. The first is because empathy empathy is cringe, but it's because you have to feel the suffering of other people, and this leads you to be volatile. The second reason is that people weaponize empathy. The third reason is that empathy hinders your career goals because you feel bad, etc. And fourthly, it is a empathy leads towards a worst measure of happiness because sometimes it is hard to maintain a connection. You get desperate to want to maintain this. Life moves on, your preferences change. There's a fragility in a lot of relationships. And the problem is that when you have empathy, this fragility worries you, it destroys you, etc. And that's why being a sociopath is good. So notice the burden, obviously, is to prove that empathy is bad. The reason why that burden is legitimate for OG is because obviously a sociopathic person does not have empathy. Therefore, if we prove that empathy is a bad thing, which is something that most normal humans do have, they generally don't have morals, they generally etc. So given that empathy is a visceral thing that people care to themselves, and most people who are sociopaths don't really have empathy or moral compasses. They do have interests. They're still normal people. They just don't get tied down by empathy. This is why we should prove. So notice how, like, I have just explained what the intuitive burden of the argument is and how it ties towards what the emotion is. Let's look at what OO argues. So OO says, other people are going to treat you badly because the way the world works is a world where people can immediately tell whether a person is weird based on their tone. You, as a sociopath, do not understand these tones because you do not understand human behavior because it's generally irrational, i.e., you should love your friend even if they screw up and they do something stupid. And this is bad because this harms your utility as a person. Most sociopaths care about the transactional relationships they can make, but the problem is that if other people hate you, then that probably harms your interests. And the second argument is just cognitive dissonance, because society tells you that you should be empathetic, you should feel a sense of guilt, but you cannot feel that way because you are literally born to never feel that way. You're born to never understand these principles comparatively to a normal person. They can understand why it's good to be etc. So from then on, from what I've given, I want to just do like a very quick like quiz session here. From this first exchange, can you guys just type down what is the intuitive, firstly, what is the clash that's going to go on here? And secondly, before I explain evaluation, who do you think wins from this first speaker exchange alone? You can type it in the chat. You can type it to me right now. I do want to see just how like people kind of like go into this. You don't have to give a full on OA. You can just give like a very one-liner thing of why you think a specific team wins based on this one specific comparison already. So I'm just gonna wait real quickly.
Wait, sorry, which comparison is this for again?
The first OGLO, I've just explained what the arguments are. I want you guys to dictate the clash, and from the first speaker exchange, tell me who do you think is winning. Yeah, I'm seeing nothing in the chat so far. If you guys want to unmute as well, that's also, or if you if absolutely if like if you don't want to if you still don't know who's winning, you can just envision to me what the clash is already from the get-go. What is the issue? What is the metric? Okay, I got one. How does sociopathy affect the human experience? OG wins because Mac is more clear to me. Okay, I got one. Anyone else want to try give it a shot on judging this first speaker comparison? There are no wrong answers, by the way. I'm not looking for a right answer. Okay, I think I'll just jump right in because I don't think anyone's giving the answers. So from the only answer, behavioral sanction, LO personally for me seems to engage on outcomes, how people behave, closes the OG. Okay, so I've gotten some answers. Okay, so I have generally mixed. There's some people who say OG. There's some people who say OO. There's going to be a lot of like ways that I think there's going to be from the face value. There's probably going to be a lot of like you guys are gonna have your own opinions on why you think a team wins, and that's okay. I don't think there's really any wrong comparison. There's no wrong verdict. There's only the way you justify that. Okay. So let's look at this just from the first speaker exchange. I want to just see how a judge kind of evaluates this as it is. So OG provides a series of reasons to why empathy inhibits people. OO doesn't really respond to this, if you've noticed. They actually just give two things which are kind of different. So they explain, firstly, that people are going to notice you and that's going to inhibit you. Secondly, you might feel a sense of cognitive dissonance because of the way that societal narratives happen. So out of the bat, it kind of becomes a bit weird because opening opposition never really explains why any counter reasons to why empathy may be good. They just give a different reason. They just bring out a completely different discussion on why ethical, like the way you are as a sociopath means that you're bad. So if there's now two competing frameworks there's no actual direct clash, like there is a issue here, technically speaking, it's just on whether you're well off as a sociopath, and there's just different reasons to suggest why that might be the case on both sides. But the issue here is that no team is actually taking down each argument. I'll go on into the responses later. The point of this exercise here, and let's see this is the thing, is just how do we evaluate claims that have, and like the way teams prove their claims and comparing them to other teams. So let's get on to the meat of the justive of how I would approach this. Empathy bad, or at least the burden of why OG proves to why empathy is bad in the way that is volatile is not responded to by LO. Therefore, we have to assume that claim to be true because OG does give reasons to suggest why is it likely that you do to some extent, your empathy is something that is volatile as a normal person that's generally bad. Given that it's the case, how does opening opposition's material weigh against this? They say two things. The first is the cognitive dissonance, and the second is how it affects your behavior. Now it then becomes a battle of what is more important? Is empathy being bad important? Is empathy being a bad thing more proven and important? Or is the fact that you're going to get screwed over by society and the fact that you might feel some sense of cognitive dissonance more important? Now, in the first speaker exchange, these answers are probably not going to be resolved But these are questions that you should already have in your head when you are listening to a debate. And that's something that is comparing material from the get-go. So LO doesn't respond to OG, so OG's argument stands because they prove it. And remember, unresponded material still has to be evaluated. In this case, OG does give a lot of reasons to why empathy might be bad. Okay, let's look at the responses, because this is where it gets really, like, this is where it gets, like, generally happens. Okay, so DPM comes out to this debate and explains and responds to the two arguments. First, they say, you cannot learn, and you can intellectualize, and you can basically learn people. You can basically learn how society works and adapt to that. So it is not likely that people are going to immediately catch on that you're a weird sociopath because you can figure it out. People can learn. And on the second, argument of society is going to shame you, DPM says if you never had those values in the first place, i.e., if society tells you that empathy is important, but you never could feel empathy in the first place, that's bad. And secondly, empaths, generally speaking, do get harmed in terms of they get devastated. This reason stand. LO doesn't respond to it. And DPM weighs this by explaining that empathy is something that you feel constantly, absolutely terrible. And the comparative is, if you don't have empathy, you can let this go. I'm going to focus on the empathy clash. I think the other ones are not that important. DLO then comes up and says, so to rebuild their first argument, they say, people can still keep up, guys. People feel tired. They can't keep it up. They can't mask this anymore. Gossiping, and the way they weigh this is gossiping goes crazy. And and the problem is that if you're still weighing on your self-interest, you won't be able to understand irrational feelings that may be important to that person because you don't understand it. So you're going to harm people more when you don't have empathy. And the dialogue kind of summarizes the clash. And then they explain that empathy gives you fulfillment, empathy gives you social interaction, and you are losing this, and that's bad. And look at Reddit. A lot of people who think this is kind of bad because people feel like they should feel these things, but they don't. Okay. Firstly, now we've seen the responses and we understand the argument in of itself. Can you guys, from this, give me a very short OA of who do you think wins this opening bench comparison? It doesn't have to be rigid. It can literally be one sentence. But the exercise I want you guys to do here is just justifying this, because this is this is essentially like an open quarterfinal. So that's generally that's why I'm just focusing on one clash. Also, I know some parts of my tracking are very weird things. That's just a me thing. Sometimes I will type my own understanding of what I think a speaker says, and I have a very different language, but don't mind that. Okay, but yeah. So let's try. Now that you guys know the way that teams responded, and the overall meat of the opening half comparison, let's hear what you guys think. Chat it to me, whatever, etc. If you guys want to unmute, that's also fine. Okay. Oop. All right. Okay, I'm getting some justifications. I've gotten 2 responses so far. I'll wait till like 9:15-ish. Giving the floor for... Oh, someone wants me to scroll to PM. All right. I have not... Oh, okay. So I've gotten a lot of like reasons of good like mini OAs. Okay. So generally speaking, I think like the ones who have given got the broad strokes correctly. So let's get on to the opening bench comparison and how you should deliver it. Now, just to flag post here, this is going to also be a note on deliberations and how you should be able to justify comparisons from the get-go, especially if you're a panel, if you're a trainee, even as a chair. Because I want to note that when you are justifying, especially in British parliamentary, where there is like consensus deliberation, you have 15 minutes to make 6 comparisons, right? You probably need to be able to ensure that the comparisons you're making, each comparison is justified in like very shortly. I'll go on panel deliberation a bit later, don't worry, but this is how I do it. OG has a claim, which is that empathy is bad. And the comparative is that you're at least able to not be hindered by this empathy. This material is largely not responded to by opening opposition. They have no direct response to this, except for the DLO extension, which is just saying that empathy is fulfilling and empathy gives you social validation. The problem is that opening opposition never responds to the crucial claim or never really explains to us why is it empathy outweighs the harms presented by OG. And we can all understand OG has a harm that has been proven, and they're able to give a comparative solvency to those harms. Okay, so in terms of like, I have a lot of questions on there's a case that was built way too late. So here's the thing. This is still something that is development. And I think to some extent, when it comes to what DLO tried to do here, which is trying to say that, you will still feel bad and empathy is great, even though LO never explains why empathy might be good. To some extent, you still have to weigh that material, but the way you weigh it is like kind of simple. The responses that DLO give still don't mean that empathy is a bad. OG is able to fulfill their burden on proving that empathy is a net bad, it harms people. OO never really explains or engages with that clash. The second part of the comparison is weighing the OO positive material and comparing that to the OG. OO does have two claims which are proven, which is that you might get caught, like you might be caught out as a sociopath and get screwed over, and cognitive dissonance exists, and you might be bad. Here's the thing. They never explain why this cognitive dissonance matters more than the empathy being bad. And I think OG already does weigh onto this, why empathy is bad, very bad, because the fact that it really devastates you and how proximate it is towards you. Opening oppositions weighing is gossiping goes insane and people can catch it. But if you think about it, this is reliant on OO being able to prove that in all instances, you would get caught or you would get people would find you weird. If you compare the balance of likelihood, opening government's claim is not really reliant on likelihood. It is just saying that empathy and the way that people feel empathy, just like it takes over you and it always controls you in a way where it makes you do things which are bad for you and in terms of the devastation that you feel. That doesn't really need to be proven in likelihood. And while OO does try to say that without empathy, life is bad, they never really explain why is the lack of this one which inhibits your character, nor do they actually crucially weigh into the fact that the cognitive dissonance is something that completely affects you. Because here's the thing. It is true to some extent. Okay, someone is writing here. And is that Raymond? Raymond, is that you? Okay, it's not Raymond, sorry. I thought it was Raymond. My point is, even though it is true that you may be affected by society, OG does respond to this, and this is where you come into the responses thing, where you can learn and you can adapt to social norms. But I think the crucial response is that, firstly, if you do not feel proximate to these values, you generally cannot, you don't feel that pain in the first place. Therefore, it is really unclear to the extent of how society affects you, because yes, DLO does have a response which says that you can still feel guilt, but they need to be able to explain why that guilt is comparatively much more likely to happen more than the likelihood of you not feeling disconnected from the world. So the weighing is like, does OO prove that the cognitive dissonance you get is more likely than OG's responses? And does OO prove that the way that society affects you is comparatively more likely than the chance of you being able to mask? If OO proves those two things, what is then more important? Is empathy being bad more important? Or is you being caught and getting that cognitive dissonance more important? If both teams prove to some extent, then you look at the weighing, right? You look at whether teams explain why this material is more important than another team's material. The way I would weigh this, and the way I did weigh it, is that at the end of the day, OO still doesn't really have a response to why empathy might be a bad thing. And I think this really affects the counterfactual, because it may be true that all the material from OO suggests that life as a sociopath might be bad. But the extent of the harm that OG provides is something which is like, it's something that takes over you and something you cannot control. That, like, it's implied that it's like it makes you irrational. On OO's side, while it may be true that you feel a sense of cognitive dissonance, OG says some mitigation to explain that this adaptability towards this, and it is maybe not that likely that you could do this. But even if you don't buy those responses, like those are weak responses and OO might be right, it is really unclear whether they solve the answer of whether that empathy, that lack of empathy and the cognitive dissonance you feel as a result matters more than the harms of empathy. They're not weighing it against the OG. Therefore, I think in some instances, and like generally speaking, in most cases, and spoiling the result of the round, it was a unanimous OG win. OG did win against OO, though it was tight. And I think there's a way for you to credit OO. I think in some universe, you can still justify that opening opposition does prove a much more tangible harm compared to OG in terms of how the lack of empathy screws you over, and they're able to win on the fact that these tangible outcomes may matter more. And I think it is valid to credit that over OG. But the point of this exercise is just an explanation on how you should evaluate debates as they happen, and like just going through how I usually flow through my thought process. Okay. I hope that helped a lot. I'm going to very quickly jump into managing panels and how to chair, how to do this, etc. Giving OAs and panel discussions will be given in the next workshop, but this is just a very short note on how you should do, on like how you ought to panel. Okay, very quick note on panels. You, even if you're a trainee, still give your justification, still give your call. You obviously want to be score, you obviously want to break, obviously give your thoughts. Secondly, try to be short, concise, and straight to the point. Don't recap a lot. Most of the time, chairs obviously know what teams have said. They want to know how you assess the comparison. You need to get on right to the justification of why you think a team weighed over the other. The third advice I have is just proper language. It's like, so just saying, I think the OO material supersedes the OG material without elaborating on why they did that. So you can't just say, I think OO is better than OG without explaining why. Judges also have to justify their reasons. So you have to assess on whether teams with a specific clash, whether their burdens were met, why were they more important than other piece of material. Obviously stick to this, obviously try to say much, but stick to what is important. You obviously have to, chairs will prioritize one comparison over the other, etc. A note on sharing in case you've ever gotten a chair. Firstly, when you are managing panel discussions, make sure that you keep it within 15 minutes and make sure that each judge has at least 1 to 2 minutes to say on a specific comparisons. The second thing to note is that obviously write down and track the initial calls, and from there prioritize what the important comparison of the round was. So if long cross was contentious, if OGCO was the most contentious thing in the round, you ought want to prioritize that the most. And last thing to note when it comes to giving OAs, when it comes to OAs, you want to firstly be time efficient and you want to be concise. Like you give the libs, you want to keep it within 10 to 15 minutes. Try to obviously avoid the language and be very explicit on the comparisons you're making. Again, this workshop isn't really focused on sharing and paneling because I think like that is an entire section on its own on how to panel and chair. This is just mostly the meat of judging and how you should go to this. I will cover the behavior, like the way you panel and judge a bit later on. Okay. Final thing to note on how you should improve judging. Obviously, I'm going to admit it, this judging workshop probably won't turn you into a majors breaking judge immediately, because the best way to improve as a judge is to get experience. Go to many tournaments, but don't just judge for the sake of judging. Do not passively judge. If you want to improve as a judge, you want to go to tournaments and listen to your chairs, listen to your other experienced panels, listen to how they justify, and this is very important. I don't care whether you are a major breaking judge or if you are like just a middle time judge. Sorry for the rough for the strong language. My point is always get feedback. Always ask your chairs, hey, how's my justification? When you are chairing and you are giving an OA, approach the debaters themselves and ask, hey, how did you think of my OA? Did you buy it? What did you think I could have improved upon? This is actually how I've always improved as a judge. Every time I went to a tournament, I always asked within the round, how was my paneling? How was my OA? And this is basically this sets the roadmap basically for you on how you're going to improve better. The second way you improve is try to watch workshops. I'm going to give a bunch of workshops which I think are like really, really cool and also kind of short. And the workshops which are really helped me out, whether it be on how to attract, whether it be how to assess top rooms, because obviously there's only so much I can do in one workshop. I cannot promise to sell you all the secrets. I can only give you a sense of like mindsets and the way you should approach judging. Finally, debate more as you judge. I think judging really helps a lot with debating, especially for the whip mains, because whipping is just judging but biased. There's no such thing as a career judge or debater, unless you are literally a career debater or a career judge. Sometimes you still like debating, but also you kind of also like judging. So you can obviously do both at the same time. I know so many really good debaters who are also really good judges. And if you notice, at a lot of top debaters, world champions even, like David Africa, Toby Leong, they are also career judge. They are also really, really great judges. Toby Leong was the best judge of Asia. David Africa, I believe, was the best judge of the Philippines in One Nationals. So like you there's no such thing as doing one thing at the same time. You should do both at the same time. In fact, it helps, and it is like not necessarily mutually exclusive. Okay, Q&A time. I have a lot of things that I want to cover in the Q&A. So we're gonna split this into two things. I of course want you guys to throw in every question you have that's important for you to give. You can message me, etc. In the meantime, I am going to go through the Q&A forms of the surveys and try to respond to them. So I'll try to just bounce between the two, and I'll try to be as essentially as efficient as possible with this. Okay. So I'm going to not answer every single question because some of them I think are some of them kind of cover the same broad repetitiveness already, so which is okay. All right. Let me just get on to the questions. Oh, yeah, Abdul asked 10 questions. Lovely. I believe this was in the survey. You asked 12 questions, I think. Okay. How to judge like Imran. I kind of already gave that. How to break as a judge. Okay. When it comes to how to break as a judge, I unfortunately have no other answer aside from try your best. Like, you should be doing your best to make sure that the justification you're giving is correct. If you want specific habits, let's say you're paneling across all rounds, you want to break as a panel. You want to give a very good impression to your chair, obviously. And this looks like being as comparative and charitable as possible. The language you must use shouldn't be discrediting to one teams. You should always be able to explain why, even if a specific piece of material was important, etc. Okay. So the short answer is improve and learn how to essentially evaluate towards this. I will cover essentially how to get better when it comes to paneling as a chair in the next workshop. But the short answer is, this, try your best to just participate in discussion, try your best to make sure that you're resolving the crucial clashes that lead to why a specific team wins a comparison. Okay, Chloe asks, are principal usually most credited? No. There is no such thing as a pragmatic mattering more than a principle, or a principle mattering more than a pragmatic. What matters is the way that teams prove this. Did they prove a pragmatic method more than a principle? If they did, then a pragmatic is more important than a principle in that specific debate. But sometimes a principle may matter more than a pragmatic. It really depends on the round. And that's something a lot of debaters should take a note of. A lot of rounds are different. Every single round is never going to be the same. Sometimes teams may go so far away from the motion but you still have to debate. So you still have to judge based on what teams argued, like etc. Okay. What to do, what not to do in the libs. I can give this. How to give good OAs. Firstly, keep it concise. Always only say what is important. You do not need to cover everything that's going on around. But of course, do give a summary of what teams' contributions did. Of course, address the responses, address the weighing, address the framing, and the implications of that framing, the implications of everything. Be attentive when you give OAs, but also make sure you're concise. How to track. Okay. So in terms of tracking, I think I gave like a full brief already, so I'm not really going to focus on that. Comparing opening and closing, short, long diagonals. Okay. So in terms of opening and in closing, and this is something that's a bit advanced, which is why I didn't really cover it in this workshop right away. But when it comes to opening and closing, you need to be able to compare the extent of which case is more important or more proven. That is the short version of it. So let's say, for example, if like maybe a closing team runs a vertical extension and you want to compare it with opening, the way you judge that closing extension is to what extent were the new contributions to this specific issue, A, not reliant on opening's material, and B, even if it was somewhat reliant on, it's not completely reliant, but it adds a new impact or it adds a new application towards that material, which is important. Comparing short, long diagonals, firstly, when it comes to the opening team, assess whether their material either preemptively responds or already outweighs the closing team. Secondly, closing teams obviously, and you should keep a note on this, have a burden to engage with opening teams. You should note whether they try to disprove a team's case or try to outweigh. If they don't engage, then don't penalize, but you should say that them not engaging with their opening when they had the chance to does take away the extent of whether they weighed against it. Therefore, it kind of puts them at a disadvantage. Never penalize while you're judging. There's no such thing as penalty judging. Sometimes the team contradicts themselves. Do not mean the contradiction is not a penalty. Just don't credit the contradiction. Sometimes teams don't bother to engage with their opening or etc. It does not mean that opening is obviously better than them. You still have to explain why the lack of a weighing or why the lack of a response or why the attempted responses were not charitable enough or were not engaging with a specific aspect, etc. How to be the one judge, not be the one judge everyone hates. Be nice. Try to sound like you know what you're saying. And I feel like this is inevitable to some extent. Some people are going to not like you. Salty debaters will always exist, unfortunately. And I'm sure we have all come into that point where we've been salty at a judge. We thought they were bad and we scored them low. But like, that's fair. I won't cover on the motion creation things because I don't think it's really relevant to this specific workshop. Okay. So in terms of weighing contributions, how does it, you need to be able to assess to what extent does the material that closing gives that is unique towards their opening, but if it is similar, it is not just weighing the material in of itself. You need to weigh the application of that material. For example, let's say the emotion is this house supports the decline of traditional television. Opening government's argument is like this is good because streaming services are good, because streaming services means that there's a lot of like people can choose the shows that they like to watch, and that's great, etc. Like you have a lot of optionality and freedom of choice is good. CG comes into the debate and says the reason that the decline was good and the rise of streaming platforms were great was because it allowed for greater scrutiny because now streaming platforms had to choose specifically what shows people wanted to see, and it also allowed for the proliferation of content that could be segmented, i.e., you could choose to watch a documentary whenever you wanted to. The comparative is in traditional shows, you probably can't really access that easily because of the fact that traditional shows follows a fixed program. So it's not just the fact that freedom of choice is good. I don't care if you have the agency to choose the shows you want to watch. You're able to access shows which are good for you. OG just says that the choice is good, but CG says that the choice is good because of the fact that it leads towards like content which is good, which leads to better discourse, etc. That's an example, but the way that you should weigh it is whether the application of CG is unique enough compared to the OG, and if it is unique enough, how meaningful it is compared to OG. Okay. All right. So let's look at the chat again. The first question I got, the question I got: how do we distinguish whether an argument is too late to be brought up, or is it timely enough to salvage a weak case for the debaters? No argument is ever too late to bring up unless you're whipping, especially in deputy, in DP opening. To what extent can a deputy fix a case from their opening? Firstly, I think this is kind of a bit more of a moral gray area. But if there's a clear speaker disparity, you want to look at the direct responses that they give. Because I think that's the material that should be weighed a bit more heavily because it's more engaging. If they are bringing up new material to salvage a weak case, to some extent, it is correct and kind of valid to point out that it's a bit too late. But even if it is a bit too late, you need to be able to assess whether the extension that the second speaker gives or a crucial weighing or response that the third speaker gives does affect. Because like, if you think about it, right, there's no such thing as too late because it is just the nature of the format that deputies are going to give responses and extensions that the other team may not be able to respond to fully. There's going to be a sense of speaker disparity. How do you weigh this? I think the way you weigh this is, yes, there's like this very banger-ass extension that came in 00. Firstly, to what extent does it salvage the case? Secondly, to what extent does it weigh against the opening case? Does it take them on fully, or does the OG weighing still win against this extension? Because sometimes an extension sounds sexy and rebuilds the case, but at that point in time, it's probably too late because there's only so much a DLO can do engaging with like a structured material. But this depends. My answer to this is there's no such thing as too late. Assess it as it is, but you should probably take it heavily with a grain of salt, even if it's sexy, but don't penalize it, obviously. Just try to okay, if O has engaged with everything of OG and is successful in rebutting it, does CO have a burden to engage with that? Or do you think that CO engagement is not sufficient in that round? The way this works is that CO, if O has already destroyed OG, CO needs to give additional new mechanisms to explain two things. Either firstly, why the new responses they're giving beat OG, or secondly, why the material they give implicitly takes down the OG. That's the way that it happens. It doesn't rely on the opening. If a team knifes and it doesn't get addressed or called out by other teams, you also don't penalize, right? If a team knifes, don't penalize, just call out the knife and explain to what extent does it take down the persuasiveness of a team, of another team's case. There's some judges that don't write a lot of things and often use phones. How do you tolerate them? This is something that you unfortunately cannot avoid. There's going to be some bad judges who have bad judging habits. If it does happen and they don't contribute to the discussion in a meaningful way, just give them the feedback that you think they deserve, and Like if they're not contributing to the discussion, just take over. Sometimes this is gonna happen. Okay. What is the structure of my OA? All right. This is the way I structure my OA. Firstly, I go right on with the verdict. Some start with general feedback. I don't really like starting with general feedback because I know debaters want to know what the call is right away. So they will immediately jump into like debaters really want to hear what the call is from the get-go. For me, I immediately go right into explaining, this is in fact what the call, like this is the call right away. So how do I then jump? So general feedback is just what you thought as debater is like, general feedback, I don't really want to give a lot of comments on, just things of what you thought the debate was missing and how you thought the debate. The way I give an OA is chronological order. So I go from opening government to opening opposition first. I compare the two and explain why one house weighs over the other. Then I bring closing government, explain what the case is, how it weighs against the gov bench, whether it takes on OO or not. Then I bring closing opposition and weigh them against the other houses. There's a lot of other ways you can give an OA, and it really does matter on your preference, but this is usually just like how I do it. Is it right to credit the team if they knifed their opening because OG had a false characterization? Depends. If OG proved their characterization, and as an average reasonable voter, if you think that a characterization is false, but the team proves it to be true, you kind of have to weigh between intuition and the substantiation and explain to what extent is this thing actually intuitively not true compared to the substantiation that is happening. And if a team wants to knife that and they legitimately knife the team, because everything debaters do has to be justified, judges have to weigh that justification. So it cannot be a one-liner, right? Things can never be a one-liner unless it's really that intuitive. So that's like the way you do it. Okay. Let's go on to how to effectively and properly score debaters. Look through the world's judging speaker score. Always look into the score. And like speaker scales are very volatile and everyone has their own perception on what a 78 speech might be. That's why my best advice is just to literally look at the score and try to base scoring on your own interpretations of what you think an 80 speech might be. But at the end of the day, there's no wrong scoring. There's only extreme scoring. And trust me, I've seen very extreme scoring. Okay. How do we evaluate without stepping in? Here's the thing, right? As a judge, you are going to step in to some extent. You are still assessing. So try not to worry about stepping in. Worry more about the way you evaluate how a specific claim is more persuasive in terms of winning on that issue compared to the other house. Because like debaters want to hear your thoughts. So try not to worry. Just don't do this too much to a point where you completely credit things without any form of justification, or you credit something and you're over crediting it, or you're not explaining why. Okay. How do we catch up and analyze in the case when they're rapping? Firstly, track extensively, try to summarize, don't overwhelm yourself. What are the right metrics in weighing? Depends on the route. But here are some metrics that you should use as a judge that you should consider in every debate. The first is on a balance of probability, likelihood. You should always question your likelihood, like understand whether a team's case is more likely than another. The second is on a case of importance. That is to say that you should be able to explain why specific bits of material matter more than other pieces of material and justify why that's the case. Because they weigh on a specific metric of vulnerability, because this issue is more proximate to something, etc. And the third is on exclusivity. Being able to weigh whether a team's argument is something that they are able to secure for themselves exclusively is a very good habit because it explains why their material is something that they're able to secure for themselves other teams cannot get that, you should be able to weigh that exclusivity. The summary of like everything I've taught you so far is 1, justify literally everything. 2, justify justify literally everything, right? And 2, track well. And like 3, when it comes to weighing, be able to make sure you're following the rules of BP. Don't go so far. Is it necessary to debate while judging? Yes, I think to some extent it does. Okay, there's another question. I have a hard time because my chair gets intimidated. I'm new to panel discussions, how to navigate. If you're a panel, listen to your chair, try to keep it short, 1 to 2 minutes, as I explained before, and be concise, straight to the point. Managing discussion as a chair, I kind of get worried that I get drowned out, which could affect my score. What do I prioritize talking about as a panel? Prioritize the most contentious pieces, the most contentious comparisons, and try to think about and bring up crucial clashes that you think need to be resolved by the judges. There's always going to be bits of comparisons you need to be made between material that are usually segmented into clashes. How do you respond to the chair in case your decisions are really conflicting? If your decision is very different, stand strong, be willing to be flipped, but don't flip so easily. If you want to be flipped, you need to explain why you did flip, etc. Okay. How do you judge a very symmetric debate? Okay. In terms of symmetric debates, think about likelihood and think about what can be exclusive, what is possibly exclusive, and try to weigh on the marginal benefits or harms that teams get. What's the difference between BP and AP? AP is a focus on judging on clashes. So you're judging based on issues, right? And weighing why issues one over the other. In BP, the dynamic is that you have to make 6 comparisons in 15 minutes. So it's more on concise. It's less focused on the tracking, or it's less focused on what teams said and how teams like material win clash. It's more on just the broad reasons to why OG wins against OO, why OG wins against CG, etc. If a motion looks one-sided, and like if a motion looks biased, like they had the harder role to do it. Firstly, do never ever give a justification like OG had like the OG basically had the lower hand here, therefore they lost because OO had the more intuitive arguments. That's worse than stepping in. That's just establishing your own burden in the room. Yes, a motion can be one-sided, and yes, it may look bad, but you still need to weigh. Never weigh like this. It doesn't matter if the motion is one-sided, etc. Okay. Whenever I judge in top rooms, I always get to bin rooms in the next round. I'm able to identify certain metrics twice in team's room, but I think it's the way I communicate in top rooms. In top rooms, when giving OAs, I think what teams prioritize, firstly, is jumping right to the point. Because top room debaters do not care, or at least care less about the summary of the debate, because they're good enough to know that they know what's going on. They want to know how you resolve clashes. You, as a chair, need to get to the meat of that when you're giving your OAs, so you can keep it short and concise, but also just give the few crucial 3 reasons why you think OG wins against OO. Can I call out false matter that was raised? Yes, it does to some extent. You can call out and you can justify that an average reasonable person probably knows it is untrue, and like even if it was proven to be true, to what extent does it improve, like screw you over? How to tackle pop fantasy media reference motion? Again, the parameter is within the round. You have to judge based on the round itself. You have to figure out what the burdens of teams were, and you have to explain what the burdens of that teams were, etc. and etc. Okay. In a match where one team spoke 79, but a third team solid 72, a lot of chairs will reduce. No, do not matchmake. It is literally wrong. This is a mistake I see a lot of debaters do. Obviously, don't go extreme. Like, actually no. Some in very rare cases, you probably round 1, you will probably see an 83 speaker go up against a 72. Even if that's the case, do not in good faith try to reduce the 82 to a 78 because you want to matchmake. Firstly, that's unfair to the top speaker because they probably did speak in 83, but you're dragging them down because of the quality of the room. Speaker scores are individual based. They are based on the speaker themselves, the extent. And if you really think that someone gave an 83 speak and like their opposition was a literal 72, give it. Like it is fair to judge speakers from what it is. You should not judge based on round dynamics, etc. Okay. How to avoid recording every. Okay, so how to give OAs in a more clear, detailed, articulate way. So in terms of how to be more concise and the tutorial for being more concise, I'll cover this more in like the sharing and like giving an OA thing. But the way I want to just like the way I want to just like really give this towards is segment it and figure out what the debaters want to hear when you're giving your OA. And this is how I give my OAs. This is how I approach OAs. I think about what is it that debaters want to hear from me? What are the clashes that they want me to resolve? How do they want me to weigh their material? How did I like? They're curious about how you're weighing their material. Think about how you as a debater want to hear OAs and deliver the OA in the way that you would like to get heard. And this is a lot of ways you can do this. You can listen to other chairs' OAs and look at very good chairs and look how they give OAs, etc. And yeah, try to do that. Okay. I don't know if I signed the right form, but in case, blah, blah. How do you measure the weight of arguments and how can you clearly address them in a short time? Again, give anecdotes, etc. while you're judging. Okay, there's a lot of the final question I'm just gonna answer is best standards to practice for beginner judges, because I know a lot of you are beginner judges. Firstly, always use metrics and explain why you're using those metrics. Explain why you are judging the debate in this specific standard. Is it because the teams agreed that this was the standard to be adjudicated on, etc.? Secondly, you do not need to fully summarize a team's contributions. Judges and chairs specifically just want to jump right into the explanation of why you think a team beats on another. Thirdly, don't simplify it. Don't say I think OG wins against OO in this issue because they explain this thing in a don't explain it in the surface value way, like I just thought this is better. In fact, never say I think an argument is better, or I thought their analysis was better. Avoid language like that. The language you should be using is, while I thought OG gave reasons to suggest why this outcome could be true, I think what opening opposition was able to explain is firstly that it is not very likely given XYZ context and OG does not contest this context, or they're not able to weigh against this. Secondly, even if we bought OG's material to be true, I think they're not able to explain why it's comparative more important than OO, etc., given that they only say impact, but they don't weigh the impact, etc. This is just an example of how you should approach giving discussion. You should approach like paneling. Try not to use very simplistic language. Reference the round, give immediately how you think, and you kind of just think a bit like a whip speaker, right? Okay, I remember I missed one question. Okay, apart from weighing, what do whips need to do? So whips respond directly, obviously, they weigh. But I think the concept about whipping is the philosophy of resolving things, the philosophy of telling the judge what is important, and the philosophy of being able to like what's the word for it? Housekeep a debate properly. That is to say, like, you need to be able to clean up the debate for the judge and explain what is important for them to adjudicate for. Whips speak to a judge. Think about it. I think that's like the way I would summarize this. Okay. Are there any more further? Okay, how to chair in okay, so this is basically how to chair when there's a lot of panelists and trainees. Firstly, as someone who's had a lot of experience with multiple panels, keep it balanced. As a chair, you want to make sure that everyone has a chance to talk. I think that's intuitive. Secondly, I think what is important is that you need to be able to reference the discussion into what you think is important, and also try to get the thoughts of other teams and make sure that there's always interaction between every other judge. Prioritize interaction between panelists and trainees as opposed to chair to panelist interactions. Because when there's a lot of panelists, it is your burden as a chair to be able to know what their skill is, to be able to score them. You don't really need to give your thoughts as much, because the panelists judge chairs on two things. The first is on the quality of how they manage the deliberation, and secondly, how they're able to chip in their thoughts and resolve clashes, like etc. Right? So like always try to follow these things. I hope that it helped. Okay, how to adjudicate humor, pop, fantasy, media, reference, motion. I think I did answer this. The first way is being able to understand what the metric is within that round based on the emotion, but also within that round, teams are going to argue on a specific issue which they think is important. You have to assess whether they fulfill that issue and why that issue is important, even if it is a very different metric. Because every single motion has different issues because they have different teams. Okay, so I think I'm going to end the workshop here because it's been 2 hours. I will post the workshop. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to very quickly create a feedback form, because obviously I do want to hear more questions. I want to be able to hear more things, etc. And I also want to be able to improve on giving workshops, obviously. The second workshop is probably going to be next in 2 weeks. What I'm going to do is next week, the workshop is going to be very specifically focused on how to chair and panel. So there's going to be 2 sections. It's just firstly how to be a panelist, how to go about being panelist, how to break as a panelist, how to get promoted from panelist to a chair, and secondly is obviously how to chair. This workshop is just mostly focused on the fundamentals of judging and things that you should not do, things that you should ought to avoid. I know it's not the most comprehensive, like you probably won't be the best judge ever, but I hope that this has at least given you guys a sense of an idea of what you can do. So I think I'm going to stop the recording right here.